In 1981, a woman was found dead in her apartment in Mansfield, Ohio. Even though the police did their due diligence and ran down all possible leads, the case went cold. And 40 years later, DNA evidence was able to help solve this young woman's murder. Today, we'll be talking about the death of Deborah Lee Miller in Mansfield, Ohio. So Deborah went by Debbie, and she lived in Mansfield, Ohio, which is about an hour and a half outside of Cleveland, Ohio. It's just a small town, not much going on, and its nickname is actually Danger City, and it has been for a very long time. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. There's quite a bit of crime, both violent and property crime, that has been ongoing for many, many years. I mean, we're talking about a crime that was committed over 40 years ago, and the city continues to maintain that name. The name actually comes from the Prohibition era, where the city was used as a hub for gangsters, really, to, come in and out with speakeasies and store their illegal alcohol, illegal at the time. And so, of course, that created a lot of crime. When you do anything illegal, when you have activity locally, that's just going to spread and it's going to become pretty persistent in the area. And that's what happened here. Now, it's a really pretty town. I looked at it online. It looks really, really pretty. Probably a nice place to visit, but I don't know exactly what you'd be visiting. What would you be looking at, really? They cite one of their main attractions is the Ohio State Reformatory. And that's only because it was featured in the Shawshank Redemption movie. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend. One of the best movies ever made, in my opinion. But that's really what you'd be going to do, is visit the Ohio State Reformatory, which is just a jail. So if your highlight as a city is an old jail that you can now tour, I don't know that I want to go. But this is where Debbie lived, and she was 18 at the time. She was a senior in high school, and she lived alone in an apartment. And that goes to tell you, just times were very, very different back then, even from an affordability angle. Nowadays, I don't know that an 18-year-old can afford to move out of their parents' house and live on their own at 18. And she was a waitress, so she was able to go to school and work as a waitress and live on her own in an apartment. So that kind of tells you the time period that we're looking at this point. And so she's living her life. She had dreams to graduate and then go to college from there. And then one day in 1981, she's found murdered and naked in her apartment in what appears to be a severe beating. Now, this is a super brutal crime scene that the police come into. The body had been found by maintenance workers at the apartment where Debbie was living, and the entire house was in complete disarray. There was blood everywhere, there were objects moved around, and through investigating, the police determined that she had been killed by being hit repeatedly with the grate from a gas stove. So, if you've ever seen a gas stove, those grates are usually made out of cast iron and they are super heavy. I imagine that hitting anyone with a grate from a cast iron gas stove would cause quite a bit of damage, and that's really what happened here. Um, so they collect a bunch of evidence, and of course, the police do what they usually do, which is interview a bunch of people from the surrounding area. This was an apartment complex, so they interviewed all the neighbors. There were little shops around. They interviewed people around there. Did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Just your usual police investigation. But we're talking 1981, and before DNA evidence really became what it is today, really all police did at that time was just do some interviews, and hopefully someone saw something, they have a witness, and that was kind of it. Unless they caught you like red-handed back then, there really isn't much that the police was doing to really investigate, especially in a small town. Like, the cops are just, they don't have the kind of training that big city cops would have, and that was the case here. So they're interviewing everyone, and that includes the upstairs neighbor, 25-year-old James Vanis, but he's excluded as a suspect. So the investigation pretty much ends there. They collect a bunch of evidence and the case goes cold. So fast forward 40 years later, the case is looked at again. Cold cases to this day get new people assigned to them. They look at the evidence again. They go and talk to people again, those who are still alive a long, long time later. And, they try to still solve them. Good police work doesn't really have an end date, right? So this becomes a cold case and then it's reopened 40 years later. Now, one thing that the police did really well in this case back in the 80s was preserve all the evidence that they found in the apartment, and that included two different types of blood that was found at the scene. And so when the case is reopened all these years later as a cold case, of course, now we have DNA technology. So the police start looking into, okay, well, whose blood is this? And of course, through investigating and analysis of the blood, the trail goes back to the neighbor from 1981, the upstairs neighbor, James Vanis. He was 25 at the time. Well, why was his blood type even on file for a comparison to be able to be possible? Well, this dude had quite the stellar life and career as a criminal. In the 80s, he was charged with aggravated robbery. He did some time in jail. In the 90s, he was charged with armed bank robbery. He did 15 years in federal prison for that. In the 2013s and 2014s, he was receiving stolen property, and he was also committing theft. So this dude is a career criminal and apparently had been for a really long time. But because DNA didn't come into the picture until many, many years later, he really wasn't a suspect in this crime at all in 1981. So the cops probably just did a little interview back then. Hey, did you see anything, hear anything? Nope. All right, have a nice day, sir. And that was pretty much the end of it. In 2021, when this case was actively being worked again and the connection had been made between the DNA evidence and Mr. Vanis, well, the cops go to pay him a little visit and have a little conversation. And the way they describe it is that they were just going to go talk to him. They didn't bring up anything about DNA evidence on file or any details. They just wanted to interview him and ask him about what he could remember about the crime in 1981, the death of his neighbor in 1981. And dude recounts the story as if it was yesterday, even though it had been 40 years. And he says, well, there was a homeless person that was trying to break into Debbie's apartment, and I basically chased him away. And so, she was very grateful for that. And that implies that she was so grateful, in fact, that she invited him in to have sexual intercourse with him. Now, I have lived alone in apartments for many, many years and in different areas, nice apartments, poor apartments, in the ghetto. I've lived just about anywhere. I have never been so damn grateful for a neighbor to help me out with something, anything, that I'm inviting them in all of a sudden, okay? So that story just doesn't hold any water. Like, to a rational person, it would be very unlikely that she just invites him in. I think a simple thank you would suffice. But this is his story. Yeah, she was super grateful. I went inside, we had consensual sex. That's why my DNA is at the crime scene. So Vanis basically says, yeah, we had consensual sex, but then I got sick and I left. And so that's how he justifies his presence in the apartment. Now, mind you, the cops had never even brought up, again, no DNA evidence being found at the scene, nothing linking him to the crime. This dude is just spitting out a story to obviously give himself an alibi and, excuse his presence in the apartment. So once the interview is over, obviously the cops are highly suspicious at this point, and so they do some more internal discussions, and they decide, okay, we're gonna go do a second interview with this dude. And when they go to do that, Vanis basically says, yeah, I don't want to talk to you, and I want an attorney. So he shuts down the conversation right then and there, and it moves nowhere, right? Well, after the interview, that was no interview, ends, he decides, you know what? They're on to me. So he runs. He basically packs up his house and runs. In his haste to flee, Vanist leaves behind some guns. Well, he's a convicted felon, so he's not allowed to possess any firearms. And once the police find the guns, connect them to him, obviously there's now a warrant out for his arrest. So they find him and they bring him in. They arrest him, they bring him in, but he posts bail. So now he's out again. And what does he do? He decides, well, I'm just going to flee once more. He's quickly found by the police and he's in a hotel. And unfortunately, he just barricades himself in there. He does not surrender. SWAT team comes in and he opens fire. He does wound one of the police officers who does survive, even though he needed some surgeries. He survives. But basically, Vanist is not going to be taken out alive. And it's in the shootout, he basically dies. And that's kind of the end of his story. So basically, the prosecution in this case says that they were ready to bring a whole bunch of evidence to the table, and this would have been a circumstantial case, but they were absolutely convinced that they had the right person. This individual was someone that had a long and very violent lifestyle for as long as he was alive. Ever since he was a teenager and into the days where he was killed by SWAT, he really had been a violent offender his entire life. So they were 100% convinced that they had the right person, and the evidence supported that. So yeah, that's really the story. I mean, unfortunately, the person wasn't brought to justice, but in a way, the family did get some closure, hopefully, out of knowing that the person that committed the crime was actually no longer walking the earth. And I'm sorry, but that's just kind of what he deserved. He took a young woman's life many years earlier, and then he just continued to commit crimes because that he thought that's just the way he should be living. So please consider liking and subscribing. I'll be coming out with videos on a weekly basis, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.